Uniforms have been worn by armies for centuries. War has changed over hundreds of years, and so have the uniforms. Uniforms were originally worn to differentiate between allies and enemies. Now, uniforms are worn for much more than that. Today, uniforms are worn to carry weapons, canteens, supplies, and technology, and to blend in with surroundings. Uniforms are a huge part of war, and they can even help lead to victory. Uniforms evolved quickly during the Revolutionary War. The Continental Congress officially declared brown as the color of American uniforms. However, officers generally cared more for blue, and by 1778, many members of the Army agreed.
The Continental Congress allowed General George Washington to establish the first official American uniform on March 23, 1779, when General Washington decided on blue as the primary uniform color. Depending on the unit, uniforms were either lined with red or white. Not every member of the Continental Army was able to receive a uniform due to the supply of fabric and labor during the war.
Uniforms were used to distinguish between the Union Army and the Confederate Army during the Civil War. During the early months of the Civil War, uniforms were provided by the states, towns, or wealthy people, and generally represented their cultural descent. The dress code was strictly enforced for the first year of the Civil War. Officers were usually told to pay for their uniforms, which included more detail work and were occasionally sewn by hand. Soldiers and enlisted men often wore navy blue frock coats that hung about mid-thigh length and a matching forage cap. These soldiers were usually lower in rank. Generals, colonels, and majors would wear double-breasted coats as a sign of rank and status. Union sharpshooters were the only exception to the color. They would wear forest green uniforms to help them camouflage with their surroundings. The typical Union uniforms were made from wool and featured a dark blue shirt with 4 brass buttons. The pants were dyed a navy blue as well until 1862, when they began dyeing the pants a lighter sky blue. In the beginning, the Confederate Army had a wide variety of uniforms too. Some soldiers even wore dark blue uniforms that could be mistaken for Union uniforms, but after 1863, they all became gray uniforms. Since uniforms were homemade at this point in the war, the dyes would often turn out brown instead of gray. The soldiers would earn the nickname butternuts due to the color of the uniforms. The uniforms included cotton shirts and denim cotton pants, since cotton was a product of the South. The Southerners tried to make shoes, but they would become worn out quickly since the successful shoe factories were located in the North. There is a legend that says the Battle of Gettysburg first started when the Confederates went into town searching for shoes. Confederate soldiers carried less on their back than Union soldiers. They would only carry a rolled-up blanket with belongings rolled up inside the blanket on their backs. This was lighter and easier to carry than a knapsack. There were a great variety of combat field uniforms developed and used by U.S. Army infantry, airborne, armored, and other arms and services in World War II. The Navy and Marine Corps had their own additional standards and issues of clothing and uniforms. Standardization was needed to supply the huge manpower buildup of the pending global war. As World War II progressed, uniforms changed, driven by field experience and also by production requirements for efficiency and the need to preserve scarce materials. Keep in mind that as new items of clothing and equipment were developed, they only slowly made their way into general use. A year or more could separate the manufacturing process from actual use. Some units were still using pre-war equipment in 1945, while other units had the latest issue.
There was a great deal of change made to the American fighting uniform during the Vietnam War. This period represented the most advances in the field since World War II. Combat uniforms during the Vietnam War were a whole new breed of uniform. New materials were demanded by the tropical heat of the area. One notable difference in combat uniforms were the slanted front pockets. There was a considerable difference in the dress uniform between the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Heavy wool was eliminated from the U.S. Army and Air Force uniforms. The design that was developed in the 1960s has virtually remained the same. A lot of the uniforms worn were left over from the Korean War, which were not well suited for the combat needs of Southeast Asia. As a result, soldiers bought their own uniforms at sporting goods stores where the pattern was known as duck hunters because it was intended to be used by hunters. Another introduction to the special uniforms were known as tiger stripes. No one knows where the pattern originates, but the style became a popularity among American special forces. Aviation was vital to the Vietnam War. The backbone of many operations were helicopters as well as bombers, jet fighters, transporters, and scout aircrafts. These developments led to new flight suits for pilots and crew members.
Today, soldiers fighting in the Iraq and Afghanistan war are much better equipped to deal with warfare. Their uniforms are camouflaged to hide well amongst plants, bushes, and sand. Our Army now wears a belt which can hold several items including a canteen. They wear heavy-duty boots that are designed to give ankle support, grip the terrain, and provide foot protection. Each shoe weighs about 2.5 pounds. Each soldier traditionally has 2 dog tags that are to be worn around his or her neck. When soldiers are killed in battle, oftentimes the dog tags are used to determine who the soldier is. Warfare and war uniforms have changed dramatically since the Revolutionary War and have grown to be a means of keeping our soldiers safe from the environment in which they are fighting. Although uniforms have been modernized to fit the current forms of warfare, they still represent who we are as Americans.